A man named Gene nervously prepares a hotel room for a very unusual night. He lays a cloth on the table, arranges a chair, lights the candles, and sets out the cutlery. Then he sits down and waits for someone to arrive. He keeps introducing himself in front of the mirror as if rehearsing. Soon, there is a knock on the door. Gene opens it and finds another man, Dan. They awkwardly shake hands and Gene asks if everything is to his liking. Dan says he likes everything: the table, the flowers, the candles, and the scent. Both Dan and Gene are extremely nervous. Dan suggests that they just dive in, and Gene agrees. Gene gives Dan about 20 pills, which Dan immediately starts taking. Dan picks up one pill and asks Gene about it. Gene explains that it is tranexamic acid, which helps regulate the female menstrual cycle and slows down bleeding. Gene asks Dan if he would like a drink, and Dan agrees. Gene pours them both a glass of wine and they toast to a perfect night. Dan puts his glass down and tells Gene that he is already starting to feel the pills. Gene suggests they get everything ready. He places a stove and pan on the table while Dan closes the curtains. Then Gene takes out his phone and starts recording. Dan records his consent, saying that he has agreed to everything he will do and everything that will be done to him tonight. After that, Gene records the same consent. Dan tells Gene that he cannot believe the night is finally here. Gene says he is happy Dan came, and Dan says he feels the same way. He tells Gene that he was worried this would turn out to be a big joke. Dan then says he is ready. Gene places a sheet on the bed and Dan lies down on it. Gene brings out the surgical tools. After confirming that Dan is ready, Gene amputates Dan's private parts. After tending to Dan's wounds, Gene proceeds to cook the amputated part. Gene tells Dan that it smells like nothing he has ever smelled before. Dan agrees that it smells incredible. Gene helps Dan to the table and serves the cooked part to both of them. Dan thanks Gene for doing this with him, because nobody else understands. Gene thanks him too and says he is excited for his turn next. Just as they are about to eat, there's a knock on the door. The woman outside says it is the police and tells them to open up. Gene wraps up the bloody sheets and hides them in a drawer. He tells Dan to hide in the bathroom and not come out. Dan immediately comes back out and tastes the dish. He tells Gene that it is really good. Gene puts him back in the bathroom, then tastes it himself before opening the door. The cop enters the room and starts looking around. She asks his name and he says it is Gene Gherkin. She asks if Dan Bender is there with him. Gene says he does not know anyone by that name. She asks who the 2 glasses are for and he says they are for him and his friend. The officer explains that Jill Bender, Dan's wife, found cryptic emails on Dan's laptop last week. Concerned, she followed Dan and saw him enter this room 10 minutes ago. She called the cops because she fears her husband's life is in danger. Gene asks whether she would need a warrant to search the room. She does not answer and instead asks where Dan is. When Gene does not respond, she starts searching. As she is about to open the bathroom door, Gene screams. She enters the bathroom but does not find anything. When she comes out, she asks Gene why he shouted. He denies shouting and says he just got scared. She tells him that if he sees Dan, he should tell him his wife is looking for him. As she's about to leave, Gene asks for her name and badge number, saying she violated his rights and that he is going to file a report. Dan comes out, believing the cop is gone. She draws her gun and tells both of them to get on the ground. Gene tries to explain, but the cop hits him. She tells Dan not to move and calls for backup. Gene asks her to let him explain, but she tells him to shut up. She tells backup that there are 2 gay men doing some weird Silence of the Lambs kind of thing. Gene tries to tell her that they are not doing anything illegal. She says assault is illegal. Gene tells her that he has a recording of consent from both of them. He also says that even cannibalism is not a crime. Other cops enter the room. The female cop tells them that Dan agreed to have his private part amputated and eaten by Gene. Dan corrects her, saying that they split it. Gene adds that they agreed on it beforehand. He then plays the consent recording for the cops. The cops tell Dan that he is going to need medical attention soon. Gene then tells them that the female cop forced her way into the room. The other cops quietly tell her that they did not have probable cause. One of the cops takes out his phone and searches the law. After checking, he says that with consent, it is not technically assault. The cops apologize to both men and leave. Once they are gone, Gene and Dan agree to continue their night. The episode ends with both men proceeding with the amputation of Gene's private parts. Like and subscribe the channel for more videos like these.